The cultural and intellectual achievements of classical Greece are usually seen as being the bedrock of Western civilization. I think it's only fitting that we dig one layer deeper and see where classical Greek culture came from. And the immediate origins of classical Greek culture are in the Archaic period. And now that we've examined the Archaic period in terms of its overall history, I think that it's fitting that we take an in-depth look at the cultural achievements of the period between about 800 and 480 or so. So without any further ado, let's take a look at this period with a focus on poetry, oracles, and the earliest philosophy. Before we get into the cultural flowering that occurred in Archaic Greece, I think that it's worthwhile to review the general context of the Archaic Greek world. This is a time period between 800 and 480 BCE. So this period begins with the emergence of the polis and ends with the conclusion of the Persian Wars. This period saw population growth and increased prosperity throughout the Greek world after the Dark Ages, which was a time with relatively low populations and little expendable wealth. This period also sees Greek colonization throughout the Mediterranean world, especially in Asia Minor, Italy, and Sicily, but also on the north coast of Africa and what is now Libya, and along the Black Sea coast as well. Political strife during this period is widely attested. We know that there were significant battles which went on within polis communities, sometimes between various contenders to the throne, sometimes between different aristocratic groups. And what we see throughout this period is increasing size and complexity in architecture and a movement towards realism and detail in art. There's really not much question that the two best known products of the Greek Archaic period are the two epics of Homer. And this naturally poses the Homeric question: who was Homer? Different scholars have come to different conclusions. Some people think that there was a single poet who wrote both epics, while some scholars think that there was a single poet at the heart of each epic separately, that there was a different poet who wrote the Iliad as opposed to the Odyssey. Other people still see both of these products as being the work of a large number of rhapsodes working over a long period of time, and that Homer is sort of just an invention, an invented name to try to give authorship to something that has no clear author. At any rate, though, there is an ancient tradition that there was a man named Homer who was a wandering blind poet who hailed from the island of Chios. Homer would have lived around the late 8th or early 7th century, and it looks like that's also the period when this poem took on, or these two epics, took on their current form, more or less. There was some editing later on, especially under Pisistratus in late Archaic Athens. So what are these two epics and what are they about? Well, the Iliad is the story of the Trojan War, and it deals quite a bit with warrior ethics, aristocratic honor, and things of that nature. And it tells the story of a combined Greek expedition to the city of Troy, where they were avenging a wrong done to the king of Sparta, Menelaus. The Odyssey is about one of the Homeric heroes from the Iliad named Odysseus, and it details his 10-year journey home to his island of Ithaca. And this also gives quite a few details about the aristocratic values of the time, or of that perceived time. Maybe it actually was talking about early Archaic virtues or Dark Age virtues of gift exchange and things like that. Both of these epics are seen as historical by the Greeks, at least the ancient Greeks. They viewed these as recording actual events happening to actual people, and then they extracted moral lessons from these stories. But modern scholars see them as stories that have accretions of detail which come from different centuries. For instance, in the Iliad, the way that Homer describes the soldiers being armed only makes sense if we think that weapons from about a 500-year span were all in use at the same time, which archaeologically we have very little evidence to think that that was ever the case. We think that weapons went out of fashion and stopped being used. But if we do date the Trojan War to approximately 1200 or so BCE, it doesn't make a lot of sense that there would be weapons which weren't invented for another few hundred years there, unless these poems are sort of an accretion of various details and stories woven into one single narrative. The other formative and indispensable literary figure of the early Archaic period is Hesiod. He wrote shortly before 700 BCE, give or take. According to his own writing, he was a shepherd who was called to his work by the Muses. He has a few different works, but the two best known and most important are Works and Days and the Theogony. In the Works and Days, he addresses the work to his good-for-nothing brother and tells him all the details about how to farm. So that is often used by scholars to try to get at what farming was like in this early period. And also, it sort of points to the kind of agricultural knowledge that an average Greek could be expected to have. But by far the more interesting work, at least in the eyes of most modern scholars, is the Theogony. And this is basically this mass of random material gathered into a theological anthology, which tells us about the divine genealogy of the Olympian gods, the story of Prometheus and Epimetheus, the story of Pandora's box, and all of the major events in Greek mythology that we take for granted today. Now, granted, this didn't contain everything that we know about Greek mythology. Some things, such as the tale of Jason and the Argonauts, weren't fully recorded in detail until the Hellenistic period. But this is sort of the greatest single collection of Greek mythology ever assembled. One of Hesiod's less appealing characteristics is that he's highly misogynistic. In one of his other works, he talks about there being three kinds of women, and all three of the kinds of women that he depicts are all negative stereotypes. In addition, one of his stories about Prometheus and Epimetheus is that Epimetheus accepted a wife, and that was the worst thing that ever happened to mankind. I guess in many ways, Hesiod was sort of the original MGTOW. Along with Homer, the writings of Hesiod are considered to be something like a Greek scripture. This was sort of a shared cultural heritage, a text that all Greeks would be familiar with, whether you're a Greek aristocrat or a commoner. And from these texts, Greeks would derive a common mythological history, a common idea of what the gods were like, and a common sort of set of values. Now, these values would be fairly loosely constructed, and we'll see that one of the characteristics of the Greeks from an early period is that everything in Greece, including the dictates of the gods, were infinitely negotiable. And that is about as clear here and in Homer as can be. Especially in Homer, we see that people try to bargain with the gods, and in Hesiod we see a similar thing. And later on we'll see that when it comes to oracles, Greeks of a later period feel that they too have a say in what the gods mean and what the gods should do. So let's move from a discussion of the particulars of Homer and Hesiod into a discussion of Greek religion in a broad sense. First of all, there is no Greek religion as such. Religion in Greece is not centralized, and it is also not clearly divided from other aspects of life. The polis as a whole is considered to be competent over all of its affairs, including matters of religion. There's no idea of religion as being something that's a matter of private conscience, or at least there's not that idea before the time of Socrates. Oracles are perhaps the most interesting aspect of Greek religion, and they're another sort of connecting block between various Greeks, and also between some non-Greeks as well. What an oracle is it is an international center where individuals and polis can go to ask questions of the gods for a fee. The three major oracles in the Greek world are Apollo at Didyma, Zeus at Dodona, and Apollo at Delphi, with the last Apollo at Delphi being by far the most authoritative and important. What happens at all of these oracles is that a priestess will receive vision from the gods, and then she will begin raving in a kind of speaking in tongues type of thing. and then the priests who are around her will record what she says and then interpret what she's saying, and then put that into a clear verse form, and then hand this finished poem to the suppliant. And when the suppliant takes away this poem, he, or in the case of a polis, they, will have to then interpret the poem for themselves to decipher the meaning of the gods and the nature of the future. Let's take a closer look at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. This site had been in use since the 14th century for some religious purpose, presumably to Apollo, but it was definitely a center for Apollo from the 8th century forward. This, as I mentioned earlier, was the largest and most authoritative oracle in the Greek world. So if you needed to consult about issues of colonization, war, or peace, say if you're a major polis, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi is the place to go. This is also the marquee location to learn about how to purify a contaminated site. Say if someone got murdered on your Acropolis and you need to learn how to purify the site to make sure that the gods are not displeased with you going forward. What we'll see is that some polis will actually set up their own treasures and sanctuaries at Delphi, and by doing that, they gain special privileges, like the ability to cut in line and ask the priestess first. So basically, it's a pay-to-play type of arrangement. And also, all of these oracular sites are independent of any given city and rely on the fees that they charge for their living. Now, at Delphi, the priestess sat in an area near a volcanic vent, so a lot of people have speculated that her ravings came from the fact that she was simply high. And that is, I guess, possible. But one thing that people often ignore is that all of these sites, being international sites, are visited by many people, and that the priest and other residents of these sites would be very well informed about international affairs. So if they were asked a question about, what should we do now that the Persians are invading, the priest here will be very aware of the relative power of, say, Persia and Athens, and they will advise accordingly. One funny story about the oracles, I believe it was the oracle at Delphi which gave this response. A small city won a very minor victory. I believe it was during the Peloponnesian War. They captured one or two triremes, and they were really proud of themselves, so they went to make a dedication at Delphi, and they asked the god the question, which polis is the greatest? And the answer was not to their liking, because the oracle responded by giving a detailed list of who was the best at each thing. This city, it has the best warriors, this city has the best pottery, this city has the best food, the most beautiful women live here. And as for your city, well, you're not really the best at anything. In fact, you're not even good at anything. You guys are the most mediocre, unremarkable polis in the entirety of Greece. There's nothing that we can say about you that would be both praising, worthy of praise and accurate. So basically, I guess you could say that was a waste of a fee. But given the small size of that polis, the temple wasn't depriving itself of much revenue. Before we venture too far afield away from the subject of poetry, I'd like to look at the two great Spartan poets of the Archaic period, Alcman and Tyrtaeus. So, these men are both roughly contemporary, and the two of them really do a good job between them of demonstrating the changes that were brought about in Spartan society by the Lycurgan reforms of the 7th century. So, Alcman was a lyric poet, and Alexandrian compilers of poetry in later periods saw him as one of the best ever. Alcman's interests are in the natural world, the details of religious ritual, and the beauty of women. Tyrtaeus, on the other hand, is only interested in military affairs. He wrote during the Second Messenian War, 685 to 668 BCE, and mostly he only writes about fighting, killing, and being honorable. What we see is sort of a conflict of interest. We see Alcman as kind of this representative of the Sparta that was fading out, this Sparta that was a normal Greek polis with a wide variety of interests and occupations, and Tyrtaeus as this representative of a new Sparta which was strictly military. And I think that these two provide sort of an interesting artifact of that period of transition. Let's now discuss the birth of philosophy in the Greek world. This is something that I like to call the Ionian Awakening, although other scholars have other labels for it, such as the Greek Enlightenment or the Ionian Enlightenment. It doesn't really matter what label you prefer, just find one that works for you. At any rate, Ionia was the wealthiest and most populated Greek area in Asia Minor, so it kind of makes sense that that would be the area where this would occur. Usually where you have the most expendable income, you have the most leisure, and where you have the most leisure, you have the most cultural activity. This is also an area where Greeks are able to make easy contact with the advanced cultures of Lydia and Persia, and they're able to gain a lot of exposure to foreign ideas. Ionian thinkers had a pretty broad range of interest, and we'll see that they were internally diverse despite the fact that they were all Greeks who hailed from a single small region. Mostly these early philosophers wrote in verse. It actually was not until the time of Herodotus that we see a major prose writer. And Herodotus, of course, was a historian, not a philosopher. For the most part, though, despite the fact that there's quite a bit of variance in the interest of the Ionian philosophers, this interest does tend toward what we would call natural science more than what we would now call philosophy. But we'll see that the range is still pretty broad. The first known Greek philosopher is Thales of Miletus. He lived from about 625 to 545. And he studied in Egypt and Mesopotamia, so that is where he got the basis of his knowledge, and then he decided to build on that by his investigations. During the course of his life, he served as an advisor to rulers, a mathematician, and an astronomer. He also began the endless debate over what the one substance is, the one substance that composes everything else, and he said that the thing which makes up all other things is water. Now, Thales earned a spot as one of the 7 sages of Greece. That list is somewhat debated. There are some people who are on it sometimes, but not on it at other times. But Thales is a pretty permanent member of that list. According to one tradition, Thales actually has some Phoenician ancestry. Not really sure if that's true or not. And if he did, that would explain his easy access to Egyptian and Mesopotamian learning, since Phoenicians were a little better connected in that network. Also, he usually gets credit as being the first person to break away from mythology and try to explain the natural world through what we would call observation or empiricism, and thus he is, by definition, the first philosopher, the first lover of wisdom. The next great philosopher from Miletus was Anaximander, who lived from 610 to 540. Anaximander was primarily known as an astronomer. His geocentric universe had the Earth at the center, with the stars orbiting in a fairly close orbit, then the moon further out, and then the sun even further out. He attempted to rationally explain the existence of the ocean by saying that the ocean was part of the atmosphere that had condensed in some way, and he also attempted to explain how primeval man had survived despite the vulnerability of human infants, and he came up with some idea that humans had once lived in the mouths of whales. He also was politically active. We know that he helped to found a Milesian colony, and this is actually a surviving depiction of Anaximander, and it's pretty rare to have a physical depiction of someone who lived this deep in the Archaic period, so this is actually a very special find. Anaximander's student was Anaximenes, because that doesn't make things confusing at all. He lived from 585 to about 528 BCE. What Anaximenes did was to take his master's grand vision and then try to work it out mechanically. So he revisited the old one substance debate and concluded that the one substance is air, but that there are ways through the mechanics of nature for air to become all the other things that we see around us. And his theory is based on the observation of condensation and other observable natural phenomena that involve air and water and the natural world. If we look at this picture, this was obviously from a much later date. This is sort of a made-up profile of Anaximenes, and I suppose it was most likely made by Tommy Wiseau, so that way Greg Sestero can get the role of Anaximenes in the straight-to-DVD drama about Anaximenes and his advocation of the idea that the air is the one substance. Next up is my favorite archaic Greek philosopher, Xenophanes, who lived from about 570 to 475. Those dates, of course, are an estimation. It was fairly rare for someone to live to be 95, although we do know that Sophocles, the playwright from the classical period, lived to be 99, so who knows. At any rate, Xenophanes is best known for his criticisms of religion. Unlike a lot of other people who saw the gods as having all knowledge and being all-knowing, Xenophanes read his Hesiod and Homer and said that it's clear to him that the gods are learning as they go, that they are learning what is good and what is bad as they go along, and that they didn't know all that going in. He also made the observation that if cows, horses, and lions could draw gods, their gods would be cows, horses, and lions. After all, he observed, other civilizations have gods who share their ethnic and racial traits, such as the Thracians, who had gods who had red hair. And when he was visiting Sicily, he observed the cliffs there and saw some sea fossils. And from the presence of those sea fossils, he was able to posit two things. One, the earth must have been covered in water at some time. Otherwise, how would these fossils have gotten in this cliffside? And two, there must be some evolution among animals. Otherwise, why would some of these creatures show a clear trend towards greater complexity at various times in the fossil record? So, Xenophanes is someone who had a broad-ranging intellect. The man was clearly brilliant, and I just wish that more of his writings had survived. I would really love to read his thoughts in greater detail, but unfortunately, what little we have of him is usually either secondhand or only in fragmentary form. Last but not least is Pythagoras. Pythagoras also lived for a long time. He was born around 570 and then died around 495. Originally, he hailed from the island of Samos, not far from Ionia, and then he left for Croton in Italy. The most enduring legacy of Pythagoras is the Pythagorean theorem, which all math students in middle school or high school have to learn. One thing that got him in trouble everywhere he went is that he was a democratic theorist, and supposedly he spread democratic ideas and set the stage for revolutions. Actually, democracy does originate in the Archaic period, and there were democracies prior to the Athenians adopting that form of government. Apparently, Pythagoras, due to his interest in numbers, was someone who was interested in equality, and perhaps that has something to do with his embrace of democracy. It also explains why he had to leave Samos, where Polycrates was the tyrant. Now, earlier I said that there's no real separation between religion and the rest of society. Well, there also was no separation between being, say, a philosopher and a politician, or between being a mathematician and a cult leader. So Pythagoras led what can only be described as a cult. He had new initiates who had to hang out and learn from his other acolytes for 5 entire years without saying a word before they were allowed to meet Pythagoras himself. One interesting thing about the cult of Pythagoras, though, is that women seem to have been more or less equal to men in that society. The Pythagorean community will continue long after Pythagoras' death in South Italy, and it will have a great impact on future philosophers, including Plato, who often talks about Pythagoras, and it also shared his view that math was sort of the building block of all wisdom because it teaches you to think logically. There are many other pre-Socratic philosophers, but I actually don't like the label pre-Socratic. I prefer to divide them by time period. So next time when we revisit with classical culture, we'll talk about Heraclitus and Democritus and Empedocles and some of the other guys who often are thrown into this heap of pre-Socratic philosophers. As someone once pointed out, one of my former professors, the pre-Socratic philosophers had no idea that they were coming before Socrates. At any rate, that is it for archaic Greek culture. In the future, I will make a video on classical Greek history and then classical Greek culture, followed up by Hellenistic history and Hellenistic culture. Until then, have a good time.